The lawyer's office smelled like old carpet and older money. Dark paneling, a window unit humming against the July heat, a ceiling fan turning slow enough that it barely moved the air. Darren Whitfield sat at one end of the conference table in a linen blazer he'd bought in Tampa, one ankle crossed over his knee, checking his phone. He had a flight to catch. He'd made that clear twice already. At the other end of the table, hands folded in her lap, was Clara Osgood, 71 years old, fourth generation on the same 640 acres in Wapello County, Iowa. She hadn't said much since they sat down. She didn't need to. This is a story about what happens when greed meets a contract written before greed had a fighting chance. And before we go any further, I want to be upfront about something. The specifics here are drawn from real inheritance disputes that have played out across the American Midwest over the past 4 decades. The names and identifying details have been changed, but the mechanics, the tractor, the clause, the moment a nephew's plan turned to sand, that part is real. And it happens more than you'd think. If your family has ever argued over land, over equipment, over who gets what when a farmer dies, leave a comment below, because this story will feel familiar to a lot of you. Harold Osgood died on a Tuesday in March 2019. He was 78 years old. He'd farmed the same ground his grandfather broke in 1911, and he'd done it the way stubborn men do, with conviction, with cash whenever possible, and with a deep suspicion of anyone who didn't understand what it meant to grow something from bare dirt. But Harold had no children. His wife, Evelyn, had passed in 2014. What he had was a sister, Margaret, 10 years younger, retired in Clearwater, Florida, and Margaret's son, Darren. Harold also had Clara, his sister-in-law, Evelyn's younger sister, who'd worked the farm alongside Harold for nearly 15 years after Evelyn got sick. Clara wasn't family by blood. She'd never asked for anything. She drove a 12-year-old F-150 with 180,000 miles on it and kept 3 dogs and planted a garden every spring in the same spot behind the machine shed where Evelyn used to plant hers. Harold knew all of that, and Harold had planned accordingly. The will was read on a Wednesday in July, 4 months after the funeral. Darren had flown in from Tampa. He worked in commercial real estate, coastal development, resort properties. He'd visited the farm maybe 6 times in his adult life. The last time was in 2009, when he'd borrowed money from Harold to cover a down payment on a condo he later sold at a loss. He hadn't paid it back. Harold knew that too. The John Deere 4440. Let me tell you something about that tractor before we go any further, because it matters to this story in ways that aren't obvious yet. The 4440 was built in Waterloo, Iowa between 1978 and 1982. It was an 130-horsepower machine, sound guard cab, quad-range transmission, a power shift option that changed how a lot of mid-size operations ran their fieldwork. It wasn't the biggest tractor John Deere made, but for a 600-acre corn and soybean operation in southeast Iowa, it was the heart of the equipment line. Harold bought his in 1980. New. He paid $39,500 for it, which in 1980 dollars was a serious commitment. He kept the original invoice in a manila folder in a fireproof box under his bed. By 2019, that tractor had logged something like 14,000 hours. Harold had rebuilt the engine once, in 1997, at a cost of $8,400. He'd repainted it himself in 2006, the John Deere green so dark and clean it looked almost black in certain light. He'd replaced the cab glass when a hailstorm took it out in 2011. The seat was newer, a replacement with armrests and a suspension base Clara had ordered as a birthday gift in 2015. The 4440 was worth somewhere between $28,000 and $34,000 at the time of Harold's death, depending on who was buying and when. That number matters. Keep it in mind. What mattered more was what Harold had written about it. The will had been drafted in 2016, updated in 2018. Harold had used the same attorney his family had used for 40 years, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had an office above a hardware store in Ottawa, and who had written farm wills his entire career. Gerald knew what he was doing. The basic structure was this. The land, 640 acres, valued at approximately $1.8 million at the time of probate, was to be split. Darren would receive a 50% interest. Clara would receive a 50% interest. Darren, in Tampa, had done the math before the reading even started. $1 million share. Even accounting for market fluctuations, even if they had to hold it a while, that was enough for the 40-foot catamaran he'd been looking at. He'd actually pulled up the listing on his phone during the flight up from Tampa. He'd named it already, in his head. The problem was the clause. Gerald Pruitt cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and read it aloud. In the event that any co-heir of the real property wishes to liquidate their interest through forced sale or auction within 10 years of the date of this instrument's execution, such co-heir must first offer their interest to the remaining co-heir at fair market value as established by independent appraisal. Furthermore, any forced sale or auction of the real property held jointly may only proceed with the written consent of the primary equipment custodian, as defined herein. The primary equipment custodian is defined as the individual holding legal title to the John Deere model 4440, serial number RW 4440 P01 2847, currently housed in the machine shed on the north property. Darren looked up from his phone. To Gerald continued, Title to the John Deere Model 4440 is hereby transferred in full to Clara Ann Osgood, effective upon my death. The ceiling fan kept turning. Harold hadn't been subtle about what he was doing. He'd talked it through with Gerald in detail. The 4440 wasn't just a tractor. It was a lever. It was a lock. It was the thing Harold had used his whole life to do the work, and now it was the thing that would make sure the work continued. Clara held title to that tractor, which meant Clara held veto power over any forced auction of the land, which meant Darren couldn't touch his 50% share, not in any meaningful way, not without her agreement, for 10 years. Unless she wanted to buy him out. She didn't have $900,000, unless he wanted to sell to her at a price she could finance. He didn't want to. Unless they leased the land, which would generate income shared equally for both of them. That he hadn't considered yet. Darren hired an attorney. Of course he did. A probate litigator out of Des Moines who specialized in contested estates. Darren's theory was that the clause was invalid, that you couldn't attach real property restrictions to personal property in this way, that the 4,440 provision was a legal fiction designed to circumvent legitimate inheritance rights. The Des Moines attorney read the will, read Gerald Pruitt's accompanying documentation, and called Darren back 2 days later. The clause is going to hold, he said. Pruitt was careful. The equipment custodian language is tied to a right of first refusal that's legally sound. You'd need to prove undue influence or lack of testamentary capacity. And from what you've described, Harold Osgood was running a farm operation until 8 weeks before his death. You're not going to win that argument. Darren called Gerald Pruitt's office and demanded a meeting. Gerald, who was 67, and had been doing this since 1981, took the meeting calmly and said 2 things. First, that Harold had been fully competent when he signed both versions of the will. Second, that Harold had, in fact, anticipated this exact response. He slid a letter across the desk. Harold had written it himself in longhand and had it notarized in December of 2018. It read, in part, "If Darren is reading this, he is probably angry. That's all right. I want him to understand something his father never got around to teaching him. This land is not a casino chip. It is not a down payment on something else. It is the thing itself. Clara understands that. I am leaving her the tool that will make sure it stays true. Clara, for her part, wasn't celebrating. She'd known about the clause. Harold had told her in 2018, sitting at his kitchen table over coffee, the way he told her most things, matter-of-factly, without drama, as if he were telling her the field corn was coming up strong. "I want you to be able to stay," he'd said. "I know," she'd said. "Darren's going to be unhappy." He's been unhappy before. Harold had smiled at that. He'd refilled her coffee without asking. What Clara actually wanted was straightforward. She wanted to keep farming the ground. She had a cash rent arrangement already in place with a neighboring operation. The Hendersons, third generation, solid operators, fair people, and she was prepared to continue it. But the rent income, split equally with Darren, would generate somewhere between $45,000 and $55,000 per year, depending on the lease terms. Darren's share, $22,500 to $27,500 annually. Not a yacht, but not nothing. She offered him a fair buyout calculation. If he wanted liquidity now, she would work with a local agricultural lender to purchase his 50% interest at appraised value, financed over 15 years. It would put $900,000, minus carrying costs, in his hands over time. It wasn't the same as a lump sum, but it was real money, and it was possible. He rejected it. He came back 6 months later and accepted it. By then, the legal fees on his side had topped $34,000. Gerald Pruitt billed Clara's estate a flat fee of $2,800 for the entire process, as he had agreed with Harold years before. The 4440 is still on the farm, so Clara starts it up twice a year, even though the Hendersons supply their own equipment. She checks the fluid levels, runs it up and down the lane, parks it back in the same spot under the north machine shed roof where Harold kept it for 40 years. The green is still dark. The hours are still ticking. Slowly now, just barely past 14,000. Each one a record of work done on ground that's still in the family. Some people will watch this and say Harold was clever. Some will say he was controlling, that he had no right to tie up Darren's inheritance with a legal maneuver attached to a nearly 40-year-old tractor. I'll leave that to you. What I'll say is this. Harold Osgood knew his land, and he knew his people. He knew the difference between someone who understood what the land meant and someone who saw it as a number on a spreadsheet. He built his will the way he built everything else, with a specific tool, chosen for a specific purpose, used with precision. The 4440 was never just a tractor to Harold. It was the argument. And in the end, the argument held. If you've ever dealt with a farm estate, a will that surprised you, a family dispute over land or equipment, a clause someone buried in the paperwork 30 years ago, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment. These stories are everywhere, and most of them never get told. Under this video, you'll see a subscribe button, a small action with a big meaning. By pressing it, you're not only supporting the creation of more content like this, but you're also becoming part of the very exchange we've been talking about, giving and receiving in harmony. It's not about the size of the action, it's about the meaning. A simple subscription tells me these words reached you. It tells me that the effort, the late nights, and the discipline to bring this message forward mattered to someone on the other side of the screen.